Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat World's Crusade, where everything has changed. The death of Warmaster Slados of the Imperial Crusade host, and the death of Archon Nadzibar of the Chaos Forces of the Sanguinary Worlds left both factions shaken, disorganized, and essentially, for the moment, leaderless. But the Imperium, it goes without saying, was of course the force that was better off for it. At least for the Imperials, Balhaut had been a victory, and most of its command and control structure was still relatively intact. It had lost its head, true, and it had lost a not insignificant number of middle-ranking upper leadership, including, after the fighting was over, General Oliphant. He had, of course, as we discussed in the previous video, been given the task of capturing Tark Island. It was a strategically vital location, as it was a major gas mining and refining location. General Oliphant had been ordered to capture the facilities as intact as possible, as their continued production would greatly benefit the Crusade. But the hostile nature of the terrain, the dug-in defenders, and their zealous opposition to the Imperials even after the death of the Archon Nadzibar made this impossible, and the majority of the facilities were destroyed. Furthermore, many of the gas pockets would continue to combust for over half a decade thereafter, burning off incredible quantities of valuable resources. The blame for this debacle was not necessarily truly the generals alone. The Chaos Defenders had been far more heavily dug in than anticipated. They had remained aggressively defending the installations even after all reasonable Imperial intelligence would have expected them to surrender. And as we furthermore discussed last episode, the Imperial Navy failed in its duty to adequately map the approaches to the target, seeing several bulk landers land straight in the ocean surrounding Tark Island, killing thousands of Imperial Guardsmen before they had even the opportunity to fight. But in the calamitous aftermath of Warmaster Slados' death, Imperial command was a cutthroat environment, with everyone attempting to secure their own advantage, ensuring that they would get as large a slice of the glory as possible and as small a piece of responsibility for any potential failures as possible. And as resistance continued on Tark Island until day 19 of the invasion, by far the longest of any of the combat operations in taking Balhaut, he was the poor man out. He got no glory and far more blame than he deserved, and would in essence be removed from Imperial command structure thereafter, until eventually committing suicide some years later. But even without General Oliphant, there were plenty of dogs fighting over the bone of Warmaster. Lord Militant Sibon, Hector Drevere, Admiral Christo, Marshal Hardiker, and General Kelso. Foremost amongst them was Lord Militant Sibon. He was the natural choice of Slados' successor. He was the foremost and most accomplished Imperial commander in the field, and had acted as the Warmaster's de facto second hand, especially during the planning of Balhaut, where his military credentials and prestige were key in securing the surprise that made Balhaut possible. as the Warmaster's sudden acquiescence to Sibon's idea of a rimward assault created a plausible alternative to the attack upon Balhaut, which waylaid Chaos intelligence just enough to allow for the complete surprise to happen. Furthermore, Sibon had also covered himself in glory on Balhaut, and since he had been in charge of military operations on the other continent, not only had he proven his ability to command vast military formations, but he was also separated by an entire ocean from any degree of responsibility or blame for the Warmaster's death or the near disaster at Ballopolis. Following up behind Lord Militant Sibon was Hector Drevere. Now he was not as accomplished, nor was he as popular, nor did he have any great glory on Balhaut either, but what Hector Drevere had more than any other candidate was an absolute and complete conviction that he was the only one deserving of the title and the job, the responsibility and the privileges that followed. And whilst he could not possibly hope to gain a nomination through achievement or reputation, as he was well aware that Slados hated him, he was more than willing to engage in quite a bit of politics, backdoor diplomacy, and worse things, if it would put him within striking distance of the Warmaster's office. The third most likely candidate was Admiral Christo, the only Imperial Navy officer on the list. Now, the Navy already put him at a significant disadvantage. This was first and foremost an Imperial Guard operation, run and organized by the Guard for the Guard. And whilst the Imperial Navy's own commitment to the Crusade was of course significant, as it was the only force capable of supplying the Guard's adventure, escorting the logistical ships and fighting the enemy's naval forces, their commitment was absolutely dwarfed by the Guard, in large parts due to the fact that well, there wasn't that much of a role for the Imperial Navy to play beyond logistics and void dominance. At least, that was the view of Imperial planners preceding the commencement of the Crusade. As we have already talked about, the enemy's forces, the Verhedwak, were expected to be nothing more than poorly organized pirate raiders, operating in de facto tribal bands with no real capability of large-scale organization or planning. They would certainly present a continuous threat to the Imperial supply lines, but they were not expected to be able to challenge the Imperial Navy in any way. Operation Newfound had proven that assumption to be incorrect, and had, in so doing, dented the Imperial Navy's prestige to the point where even though Admiral Christo had the support of 2 members of the High Lords of Terror, it was not enough. Even if his nomination was to be forced through via political means, the Guard would in all due likelihood simply not follow him. There was another man as well who had powerful backing, that being Marshal Hardaker. He had the support of the majority of the Kulan nobility, with the Kulan being the ones providing the majority of the direct support to the Crusade, being the closest Imperial sector. They furnished the Imperials with the majority of their food, their material requirements, and of course were the ones holding their supply lines open and making sure that everything reached the front line at a prompt and proper pace. Still, if 2 High Lords weren't enough, that would not be enough either. And the final contender, General Kelso, although he was an accomplished general, his primary claim to fame was the fact that he was well beloved by the average Imperial Guardsman. And whilst that might have been enough if his only competition was the likes of Hector Drevere or Lord Militant Sibon, it was nowhere even close to enough in this kind of rarefied competition. But all of this was, of course, rendered utterly and completely irrelevant when, on his deathbed, Slados appointed his successor. This was, of course, well within his rights, and everyone had pretty much expected him to pick Lord Militant Sibon, but instead Slados pointed the finger at Macaroth. A man that was a virtually completely unknown entity to Imperial High Command, to Kulan nobility, certainly to the High Lords, to the Imperial Navy, and, well, damn near everyone else. Sibon himself reportedly flew into a rage when he heard the news as he was wrapping up military operations on the western Balhaut continent. He felt betrayed, especially after Warmaster Slados had used his own well-meaning and, in his opinion, thought-out plan of the Rimward assault as a part of the ruse to lure the Archon out. Sibon, in no uncertain terms, made it clear that he felt the position was owed to him through merit, through achievement, through position, and through sacrifice. And here was some unknown youngster, apparently appointed during Slados' delirious, last pain-riddled hours, instead being elevated to the highest office of the Crusade. In such a situation, it would have been far from unheard of for Lord Militant Sibon to actively, militarily challenge Macaroth and seize the title for himself. Indeed, the majority of the contenders at the very least considered that option. But this was Slados' victory. Slados' legacy was Balhaut. The victory at Balhaut was his. The defeat and killing of the enemy's Anarch was his achievement. It could easily be said that in death, Slados' reputation dwarfed any he had ever enjoyed in life, and would thereafter become affectionately known as the Old Man. And in all due likelihood, that memory alone was the only reason why Macaroth survived the first few hours of his office. It wasn't going to get a whole lot easier thereafter, though. Warmaster Macaroth had survived the immediate, theoretical military challenge to his command, but he would continue to fight the political battle for the next 10 years. And almost another strange insurrection through unusual means, but that is classified for the moment. The most important thing now for the newly minted Warmaster was to make his mark and make it quick. The primary argument that all of his detractors were levying against him was that he was too young and too inexperienced, and couldn't possibly organize a war effort on this scale, and that the new Warmaster would likely be too daunted by the task to even get out of bed in the morning. But whilst you could accuse Macaroth of many things and many failings, timidity was most assuredly not one of them, as he announced that the next objective for the Crusade to retake the Sabbat worlds would be the Cabal system. Yep, zoom out a bit more, zoom out more, yep, it's that one. All the way over to the right there. A good 2/3 into the entire Sabbat worlds. That was Macaroth's next objective for the Crusade after the seizure of Balhaut. It was ridiculous, absurd. People had been accusing Slados of overreaching when he set his target on Balhaut. That had been called foolhardy. and reality had seemed to bear out that estimation, as Slados himself had estimated that he would capture Balhaut within 1 to 2 years, and it ended up taking 10. Yet, in the face of this enemy that had proven itself vastly more competent than anticipated, Macaroth blew every expectation out of the water and as good as declared that the Imperium's next objective was simply the seizure of the entire Sabbat worlds. Oh well. If nothing else, it certainly succeeded in disproving any allegations of timidity leveled against him, and it also shut his detractors up real quick, as stunned silence is still a form of silence, though most of them were quick with a retort. This simply proved that Macaroth did not understand what he was getting into, that he had no real concept of what a war on this scale would require of the Crusade and of him, that this was the mad flight of fancy of a man without the education and the pedigree for such a position. Hell, even Warmaster Macaroth's closest allies, those leaders he brought up with him in his ascension, even they found this a tough pill to swallow, mentioning in a very diplomatic way that whilst of course the Cabal system was a worthy goal, perhaps some more attention could be spared to the dozens of solar systems in between Balhaut and even spotting the Cabal system on the firmament at night. Lord Militant Sibon spoke for many amongst Imperial High Command when he said, "The arrogance of the man is matched only by his incompetence. This decision, which he seeks to foist upon us, demonstrates he simply does not understand what is out there and what it will take to vanquish it." And in the short term, Lord Militant Sibon would appear to have been proven correct, as the enemy vanquished at Balhaut had far from been annihilated. Some significant portion of the enemy's fleet had managed to flee the Balhaut system. An even larger portion had yet to arrive, and upon hearing news of what had occurred on Balhaut, obviously redirected themselves. At this point, Slados' initial gambit had still only secured a relatively tiny slice of the Sabbat worlds, and had actually fortified an even smaller portions of these worlds. The Chaos Raiders were now in essence trapped behind an advancing enemy line, as Macaroth threw caution to the wind and simply ordered all available forces to drive forward, securing anything and everything as swiftly as possible. The Chaos Raiders were outpaced by their enemy's advance, leaving them as cornered animals behind the Imperium's lines, where they would wreak significant damage, both upon the logistical services of the Imperial Guard and Navy, and upon the civil populaces of the worlds that they happened upon, including, of course, most famously of all in hindsight, Tarnith. Were it not such a backwards and seemingly strategically unimportant world, I am sure that its destruction would have been at the core of Lord Militant Sibon's counter-argument against the drive towards the Cabal system, as it provided a pointed reminder of what they were fighting and what the enemy was capable of. But this is where at least a portion of Macaroth's genius began to be apparent. His primary concern in keeping his seat at Warmaster was not only to placate his various Lord Militants, but also to prove to them that they could not do this without him. It was to render himself irreplaceable, much like Slados had been, though on an even grander scale, as this was to be a general advance in every meaning of the term, with the entirety of the Sabbat worlds becoming the new front line for the Imperium to push forward as rapidly as they could. And the only one even remotely capable of keeping the entirety of this operation in his mind was Macaroth. And this was to be proven quite quickly. Before the Crusade even reached Sapienka, it was self-evident that Warmaster Macaroth had, in his mind alone, conceived of an operation so perfectly interlocked that the moment a world fell, the forces required to capture the next one would be in place. The logistical elements required to resupply them were in place. He had even accounted for the casualty rates of each individual engagement. For the first few years of his crusade, Warmaster Macaroth's forces operated like a beautiful clockwork machine, one that managed to muzzle most of his ardent detractors. Though the charge of recklessness would haunt the Warmaster for a very long time, for reasons that he was, as of yet, unaware of. For you see, Macaroth's bold move, or foolhardy, depending upon what part of history you're currently reading, was not an act of sheer madness. He hadn't merely picked up a dart, thrown it at a map and gone, "That's where we're headed." It was a calculated decision, or as the Warmaster himself would probably put it, a calculated risk. It was not even merely a political maneuver either, whilst it might seem immediately politically expedient to interweave himself in plans to the point where he could not be easily dismissed or replaced, and keeping his commanders too busy to plot against him, mainly anyways, it was a sound strategic choice. It was, as absurd as it might initially seem, a move towards consolidation. Not a cautious form of defensive consolidation, not a protective one, and certainly not a cheap one if Tarnith is any example to stand by, but instead he was doing, in many ways, what the Anarch had done when he successfully seized the Sabbat worlds. You would never hear Macaroth admit it, of course, as it would be dangerously close to heresy, but the Anarch's decision to simply bypass vast swaths of the Sabbat worlds in order to set up a defensive line near the forward edge of the Sabbat worlds was in large part what had caused the Crusade to falter as much as it had. And Macaroth was trying to replicate that move. Just as Nadzibar had used the disorder of the Imperium to claim a vast swath of the Sabbat worlds, and then eventually moved to secure everything he had bypassed, Macaroth now sought to use the disordered nature of his enemy to do much the same. To secure things like the New Trail, a long series of heavily protected worlds, to move into the Khan worlds, equally dangerous, and to seek to capture the fortress worlds of the Cabal system. Planets like Morland and Jago, who had been considered bulwarks against the sanguinary worlds once upon a time. If these worlds could be captured whilst they were still weak, disorganized, and leaderless, it would save millions of lives. And it was absolutely a solid assumption to make that the enemy would be in disorder. Even the Imperium had its moment of headlessness as Macaroth was appointed, and it has the benefit of a formalized command structure, where the various officers are expected to follow the orders of their leaders, whereas the sanguinary tribes, well, they're a maddened collection of familial units, of tribes, of clans bound together by ritualistic obeisances, by marriage pacts, by blood pacts, by various forms of obligations and requirements to ancient treaties. The Chaos forces under the command of Anarch Nadzibar would have been an enormous spiderweb of intrigue, of politics, and of obligations. It would be a system that Imperial intelligence agreed would take at least 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years for the enemy to rebuild, for a leader capable of asserting himself in the way that Nadzibar had to rise to the fore and restore a modicum of command and organization to the archenemy, assuming it was even possible. There were ample examples in Imperial history of Chaos forces completely collapsing upon the death of their leader, requiring decades to reorganize. It was quite plausible indeed that the war had been won on Balhaut, and now all that remained was a vast mop-up operation against isolated tribes and cults. And if that was indeed the case, then the prudent thing to do would not be to stop and give the enemy a breathing room. It was to push ahead, to continuously keep the enemy off balance, to ruin any attempts at a succession war within the Chaos ranks in order to establish a new Anarch. Or better yet, to hunt down and kill the remaining leaders that Nadzibar had raised up. This was indeed the time to be greedy, to throw out one's hands and claim as much as one could. As Macaroth intended in his own words to strike at the head, not the limbs. This approach would entail some sacrifice. Worlds would be lost, entire planets could and were destroyed, battles would be lost, and disasters would almost certainly occur, as the Imperial Guard and Navy would both be stretched to the absolute limit of their capabilities to move as quickly as they could, as far as they could. Supply lines and communication lines would be stretched. Rear guard details would almost certainly be swamped, with enemy raiders fleeing from Balhaut, either trying to find a way back to their own lines, or simply reaving and pillaging one last time, refusing to go into the good night quietly. And then there was the threat of the orcs as well. Slados had already dispatched Imperial agents to the southern edges of the Sabbat worlds to check for green-skinned infiltration. There was no overt sign of any masked warg beginning to mount anywhere in or around the Sabbat worlds, but an area of such enormous scale and warfare as the Sabbat worlds would near inevitably attract the attention of any nearby greenskins. They would almost certainly be only small raiding parties at the moment, but if one entrepreneuring freebooters captain started finding easy pickings in the Sabbat worlds, more would swiftly follow. And if one amongst those numbers managed to make a name for himself, launching attacks against isolated Imperial garrisons or struggling overextended supply lines, the currently non-existent threat of a warg might become an all too real threat of a warg all too quickly. There were still a lot of things to consider, But for now, Macaroth's great gambit towards the Cabal system would be the Imperium's official line. It was to prove a long road, and an extraordinarily bloody one as well. But we'll be getting through it one battle at a time, as we do probably also need to mention a certain Colonel Commissar, recently elevated to the position in Slados' own memoirs and dispatched to the world of Tarnith to take command over 3 regiments, the Tarnith 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. And considering just how high Gaunt would eventually rise, I suppose it would be warranted to take a brief sojourn over to that world next week. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.